Hello. My name is Miles Whitaker. I'm the national president, outgoing president of the Pirate Party of Australia. We are sitting here today with Vinay Orekondy, and we're recording an interview on Vinay's activism around the world to go out to the Pirate Party National Congress 2025. Now, there's quite a lot of backstory here, which is increasingly interesting and fascinating for those of us who are interested in electoral politics within Australia or elsewhere. So I'll give the cliff notes here, the short summary for people who may be watching the recording back or coming into this later, or who are interested about the pirate politics movement, interested about Australian politics, or interested in the work that Vinay is doing and coming at this separately. So the context is that the Pirate Party of Australia is the local sort of outgrowth of the international Pirate Party movement, which started in Sweden in the early 2000s, based around remix culture, copyright reform, and free access to tools, information, culture, and knowledge. And within Australia, we have advocated for that, along with things such as privacy and democracy reform, open government, and economics reform, and so on and so forth. In 2021-22, just prior to the federal election, we joined a large coalition known as the Fusion Party, which then contested that and the most recent Australian federal election in 2025. In the Fusion Electoral Coalition, we are joined by parties such as the Circular Party, the Science Party, Vote Planet Party, and most excitingly in 2025, the Australian Progressives. So Vinay is one of the founders of the Australian Progressives joining us today. But more so than just these most immediate links between us, Vinay and I also have a lot of very parallel development in how our theory of change has evolved, our political activism has evolved, and how we see positive change being made in the world. So let's jump into it then, and let's start right from the start. So Vinay, what was your first political awakening?
Well, that's a good question. I think for me, if I go back to the very first political awakening, it was probably the Iraq War. So
Mm, mm,
I think late high school, I just um, was just flabbergasted. Like I just didn't understand why the US was going to war and with Iraq, and I even more didn't understand why Australia was going along with them. It was just the cognitive dissonance around it, the clearly fabricated evidence, like going on. It was like that was the moment where I was like, okay, um, I have to do something. I think, but even before, although if I think back, actually, no, that was probably my like, okay, I have to do something moment. But I think when I first became really cognizant of politics, though, was the election of the Al Gore George W. Bush election of 2000. So, like many Australians, I guess I was following U.S. politics very closely.
mm, mm.
And that was the moment where I think I just started to see, well, politics is a strange thing, right? But I think, yeah, my change moment was probably with the Iraq War.
Yeah, and there's kind of that stereotype going around as well that we all go through a few kind of political awakenings over our life, and you're definitely right to acknowledge how much of Australian culture and politics and economics is downstream from the US for better or worse. So, the stereotype is that everyone goes through about two or three political awakenings. The first one is late teens, early 20s. The second one is sometime in your 20s. And the third one is, by your 30s, often coinciding with big life changes. So, there was a major milestone in your political journey with the founding of the Australian Progressives Party. So, how did your sort of politics evolve around that time?
Yeah, I think at that time I remember being as I was following Australian politics, I noticed that there was an unhappiness around, right? And I think like with the major parties, and I was looking for, well, how can we fill it? I think at the time, the reason we latched onto the term progressive was because I know that was a term that was making a lot of headway in the United States at the time. I think that was we're looking around 2011, 2012, like what would become the Bernie movement was in full swing, and I think coming out of Occupy and things like that, that's I think the progressive movement there was quite connected. So we were looking for ways, how could we tap into that? And that seemed to be the gap as well. Is that how could you um, somewhere, I think, on our political spectrum between what the Greens represented and what Labour represented, we were aware of a gap. So that was the
Mm.
beginnings of that. We knew there were actually a number of third party formation efforts at the same time, including with a couple of former prime ministers were involved as well. So we ended up teaming up with a couple of those third party formation efforts, and that was obviously before we then discovered the broader coalition of organization of parties that already existed and ended up teaming up with them as well.
Yeah, yeah. So even during sort of the founding of the Australian Progressives, there was a lot of thought about building shared power and bringing groups together and having that sort of coalition approach. The so tell me a bit more about the Australian Progressives. You mentioned like the niche was kind of between Greens and Labor. What are some of the policies? What are some of the campaigns that the Progressives worked on?
Yeah, so its identity was very much formed as it went along. Like I think that we recognized the gap and we began right
Mm.
now, and and the other thing as well, actually, I should mention is that the specific thing that triggered it was March in March. I think in 13, I believe. There was a
Yeah, yeah.
huge, yeah, there was a huge march against the government, and what I noticed is that, and we were connected to the organizers, and we realized that this is a group that's mobilized people, right? And but where's its political home? We weren't really sure of that. So that's actually what specifically triggered the creation of the Australian Progressives. So so as that movement started, was also kind of finding its identity as well, and I think over time, relatively quickly, it found itself as a sort of as a leftist party, like with a kind of a democratic socialist bent. That was before the term democratic socialist was widespread in use in the United States, and certainly not in Australia. But it went that direction. I think partly because we were heavily influenced by some anti-poverty campaigners from the United States who came over, found our party, they really liked, and I think they saw the word progressive, and we talked and realized it was a good values fit. So they ended up helping shaping our policies and our values. And I think
Mm.
we ended up going down that path.
Yeah, yeah, and so obviously your connection to the US deepened, and you're based in the US now. So what was the pull to go from Australia to the US?
Yeah. So to be honest, it was part of it was an accident. Like I mean, I'd always had you know, having helped set up a progressive party in Australia, and recognizing that the heart of the progressive movement was, the Bernie movement in the US. I always had these dreams of like, would be nice to go and work for that one day. Didn't think it would happen. However, I won the green card lottery, and I actually didn't even know I was in it. There's a whole story there. Like I lived in the US briefly for a year, like as a recent graduate, heard about the green card lottery, entered it, just out of FOMO, really. Didn't win, thought nothing of it. But I applied from Sydney. My dad had like got the re-entry papers, and he just re-entered me a couple of times. And 9 years later, my mother got a call on my old number, and she said, "Oh, these scammers have been trying to get through, saying you won the green card." And I was like, "Oh, I'm bored tonight. Put it through." Turns out it was real. So, and I think what the reason I said, yeah, I didn't have to accept it, but the reason I did, it was because um, I was like, okay, well, I do want to connect more deeply with the progressive movement in the United States, and I'm ready for an adventure.
Yeah, amazing. And like you've mentioned Bernie a couple of times, that's Bernie Sanders, who has most famously been one of the reformist voices in the US Democrats. He's sort of like definitely not in the mainstream, but trying to bring them towards a more sort of evidence based, even values based politics. And so there was that pull there, and you immediately dove into that electoral politics in the US.
Yeah, I actually had quite a bit of luck, to be honest. That was my very first job in the country was for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign.
Amazing.
So in New Hampshire. So I was an organizer in the town of Milford, New Hampshire, and it was a very eye-opening experience, and one of the best experiences of my life. Incredibly difficult, like campaigning in the US is extremely intense. I think the last 2 weeks, I was up till 4 a.m. every night. Like it was
Mm,
crazy.
mm,
But I one of the best things I've ever done.
Yeah, amazing. And like Bernie Sanders is such an inspirational speaker as well, and so like there was always that influence on you through through Australian politics. And so what did you do after the Bernie Sanders campaign? How did your politics transform from there?
Yeah, so I actually was part of an unsuccessful effort to channel some of the energy from that the Bernie campaign into third party work in the US. I was like, okay, well, I've worked in Australia, maybe I should be trying to work on it here. And I realized it's very, very difficult to do here for a couple of reasons. I think the one of them is that because funding is so like this, like the two party system is so set up in favor of them. Um, you don't get strong leadership, you don't get strong resources, let alone voters, right? So people don't want to waste their vote, right? Because and we'll get into talking about preferential voting. People don't want to waste their vote, but it also stops third parties from getting the right kind of leaders, the right sort of volunteers, and even just financial resources to even begin to set an operation up. So they're kind of kneecapped from the beginning,
Mm.
uh, and that and I saw that firsthand. And that's when I started to, after I took a break from politics for a while, um, I decided, okay, well, I want to do something about that. And that's when I moved towards working on bringing preferential voting to the United States.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that actually. So preferential voting, sometimes around the world people say Australia has one of the best systems, and that's not necessarily the ego or pride thing. There's obviously a lot of research into different systems of government, and there's actually mathematical arguments for different methods of voting, including preferential voting. So, for the benefit of the viewers, can you briefly talk about preferential voting in Australia, and then compare that to the American system of voting?
Yeah, so there's so we have in Australia we have two forms of preferential voting. So when we go to vote in the House, you have like five or six candidates, and you number them one, two, three, four. Well, in fact, well, in the House you have to
That's
number
the upper
them.
house, the Senate you're talking about.
No, well, there's the I'm talking in the lower house. You
In the lower
also
house.
yeah, we've got in Australia, we've got our ranked choice system, and it's different from the Senate system. So just what we are, because there we've got blocks.
Sorry, it's just to
Uh,
clarify which house you were referring to.
yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, so in the lower house system, which is where you'll have you know five six candidates, and you just rank them in order. It's very similar to um, so currently in the US, right now you can't rank any in most places you can't rank candidates at all.
Mm.
You just go in and you may have six candidates running, but you just tick one of them. Right? And the impact of that is that people say, well, might like this independent or I might like this third party, but I don't want to waste my vote. I don't want to help that. I really don't like that other party. So I'm going to vote for the major party that's closest to me. So let's say I'm a conservative leaning person, and I really like a conservative independent, but you think that they're not going to win. Therefore, I must vote for the Republican Party, even if I don't really like it, because I just don't want to help the Democrats, and vice versa, right? Let's say I like the Green Party in the US, but I really don't want the Republicans to win, so I'm going to vote for them. So what it does is it entrenches the two parties, right? If every single voter is thinking, I don't want to waste my vote, then you get that problem of like just nobody's voting for them, right?
Mm.
And then they don't attract volunteers, leadership, resources, etc. So what preferential voting does is that it takes away the concept, it unrigs the system, right? It gets rid of that logic because now a voter can say, hey, I can rank for my party or candidate choice and then do a backup with a major. So let's say again, I like the Greens. I'm not sure they're going to win, but I put them as number one, and then I can put the Democratic Party as number two, right?
Mm.
So um, the preferential voting is starting to pick up around the United States, especially on the local level and a couple of states. Um, and so because of that, and people when they use it, New York was most famously just had a preferential election. It's the second one ever on a mayoral level. And everyone who's using it, like 95% plus people really love it, just want to keep it.
Yeah. I was in New York recently as well, like just days after the election, in fact. And, you see the posters, you hear people talking about it, and it's been getting so much coverage, so much chatter. But let's go back to preferential. And so a lot of in America, a lot of the campaigns talk about it as ranked choice voting. And so how so tell me more about the campaigns you're involved in there. What were some of the big campaigns you're part of?
Yeah. So one actually, I just do want to draw one little distinction between the type of ranked choice voting that we do in Australia and what's mostly being pushed in the US is that in Australia we have mandatory ranking, right? So you have to, again, in the lower house, for example, you have a six candidates, you have to rank every you have to number every box, right?
Hmm.
In the US, nobody is pushing that. They're saying rank as many as you like, but it is better, and they a lot of them are encouraging their voters to rank because it gives your vote more power. And you have there's a thing called exhausted ballots. If someone only ranks a couple of candidates and those candidates just don't make it past future counting runs, then your vote just sort of disappears. So it is better to number everything,
Hmm.
but Americans aren't great on mandatory anything, right? Um, so, so yeah, just wanted to make that distinction there.
Yep.
So some
Thanks.
of the campaigns, yeah. Um, so some of the campaigns that I've been involved in, probably the two largest that I'm involved were Seattle, and that was a couple of years back, which adopted preferential voting, and actually just had a couple of years ago we was okay, and they just had their first election because it takes a few years to implement it. And most recently, Washington D.C. And the DC campaign was won overwhelmingly for the city level. Yeah, but the council itself isn't a fan. Is pushing back on implementation. But
Hmm.
we'll get there eventually.
Hmm.
But I was also involved in a lot of other smaller local campaigns. Like there's many little cities around the country that do it. Last year there was a couple of statewide efforts which weren't as successful. I mean, there are two states which do have it statewide, Maine and Alaska, but you know it hasn't expanded yet heavily on a state level. So it's, as I said, mostly local.
Right, right. I want to dig into a couple of the technical aspects here briefly. So for the benefit of our viewers in Australia, just to clarify, the at a federal level, we have two separate houses of government: the upper and the lower house. The lower house, when you vote, you are voting for a single politician to be elected, so a single member district. But for the upper house, we have multi-member districts. So you are in fact, when you vote in the upper house, you can actually have multiple what's called senators elected to represent your state, and there's similar examples of this in state elections as well. And so we've got some sort of subtle technical varieties there, and which kind of trade off against each other to get a good overall picture. So in America, you mentioned how a lot of the campaigns focus on optional preferential voting, optional ranked choice voting. How did those debates evolved, and how did a lot of the campaigns end up deciding on, for example, single member versus multi-member methods?
Yeah. Okay. So the um, that it's a matter of it's mostly a matter of practicality, right? Because of what they think that people can accept, and because most of these we're still in the persuasion phase. People are not used to any kind of ranked choice voting, so
Mm, mm,
we're going for what's simple,
mm.
right? Multi so the movement here largely agrees that multi-member ranked choice voting is the better system. What we do in the upper house in the Australian Senate is widely considered the gold standard for all elections, right? And there's a lot of unanimity that that is the best system by far, but it's also hard to explain, and
Mm,
and
mm.
it's complex for a voter. In Australia, it's fine. We've got a really robust electoral education, right? The Electoral Commission runs those ads
It got
constantly.
very tested in the last 5 years as well. There was a few challenges there.
Okay, yeah, and but also candidates understand that they have to, and parties teach their voters through how to vote cards.
Mm,
This is how you should vote. So it's really robust. So people mostly get it, I think, because of that. When people aren't even, and we've had it for 100 years, right? If people are not used to ranked choice at all, and people are saying, "Oh, it's too complicated," even the simple version we have in the house, right? If people
Mm,
are saying, "Oh, that's too complicated,"
mm.
we've had to start with what's simple. Um, there is some exceptions starting to form around that. If you want me to talk about that, in
Yeah,
that
I'd love to hear about that.
yeah, so as I said, the system we have in Australia is a multi-member ranked choice voting. Wait, to clarify for you listeners what that means is that okay, as opposed to like if you have a state, you divide them you divide it into little districts, and each district has its own individual representative. Instead, the entire state would just be one would be one district with say 12 representatives, right? You just combine all of them, and so and the way you vote for like 12 people at once is that each party or group offers a slate of candidates, right? They can like a block, and under the Australian Senate system, you can either rank between the blocks, like I like the Pirate Party, I like the Labour Party as second, I like the Liberal Party as third, or whatever, right? Or you can rank between candidates across these blocks. So you might be a tried and true Liberal voter, but you really like this candidate from the Pirate Party, so you're going to put them as number one, and then go over to the Liberal Party and put two, three, four, five, six. So, or maybe you know them, right? So you might want to just individually go
Mm,
and vote for someone separately.
mm.
So that's the Australian system, and that, as I said, that's the system that's widely considered the best in the world. And the movement in the US was too hesitant about pushing that for the reasons I explained earlier. But the city of Portland, Oregon, actually did just adopt it a couple of years ago and had their first election in it, which was incredible and has pushed the movement forward so far. It's made us dream about possibility. And the way they did it was they had a big citywide consultation on election reform. And so there were lots of organizations and individuals involved in choosing different options. And they said, hey, this system really makes a lot of sense. So there's a lot to be said about like bringing people into the electoral reform process because then you can just get better outcomes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's core to the whole model of democracy as well. How can we bring everyone together to build a society together? Everyone gets that input. Everyone has that say, and like that's an old anarchist idea as well, that no one is better qualified to make decisions about you, about me, about ourselves than we ourselves. We're the ones most qualified to make those decisions about things that affect us. So so a lot of your time in the US, you've been involved in this ranked choice activism and campaigns around the country. Are you still involved in those campaigns, or where are you at today?
Yeah, so I've moved into more broad work but I still work closely with the ranked choice movement. But what while I was at Rank the Vote, I was doing coalitions. I was a coalitions director at Rank the Vote, and I was looking for allies for the ranked choice movement. Right? It's a non-partisan reform. Like, so we're not right wing, we're not left wing, or not centrist. We just a non-partisan reform.
Mm,
So it can be tricky in a very polarized country finding allies, right? Because often groups are organized like along political lines. So I was looking for where will our allies be, and I looked at what's the civics movement. So there is quite a large non-partisan civics movement in the US, and that includes organizations like dedicated to depolarization, service groups like Rotary, are part of that. AmeriCorps, or a service organization, a lot of bridging groups. Um, and service groups more generally. So it's a space that's been around for a while, and I became really interested in saying, well, look, I look at all the problems in US democracy right now. It all comes back to civil society being quite fractured, right? Like, or civics, like we're not, community is weak in the
mm,
US.
mm.
So I thought if anyone has to be a strong, unified movement now, it's got to be these folk. It's got to be this civil society movement, of this non-partisan movement. And so I became obsessed with the idea of sewing this movement, this space together to provide a backbone for the whole civics and democracy field, including the ranked choice movement. So a lot of what I do now has been stitching a lot of these organizations together on a local level into these things we call civic hubs, which are both spaces to strengthen community in that locality, but also as a launching pad for activity like electoral reform campaigns or like ranked choice campaigns. So it's both a community building activity and an organizing activity as well.
Amazing, yeah, and that reminds me so much of some of the activism I've done in the past with the Queensland Community Alliance here in Australia, where the model there is explicitly called broad-based coalition building, broad-based organizing, where it comes directly from an American tradition of community building, of building alliances between community groups, between union groups, and between faith groups. And so, like, the beauty of this model is that it is very fundamentally multi-partisan, because you have, obviously, unions tend to lean left wing, faith groups historically tend to lean a little bit more right wing, if we're sort of stereotyping a bit there, and then community groups straddle the divide. And so we're explicitly drawing from these groups, which are already sort of multi-partisan or non-partisan, but at the same time also are explicitly part of the civics infrastructure. And so the organising training that I went through with the Queensland Community Alliance talked about how there's the model of society broken up into three parts. There's the government sector or public sector, there's the corporate sector or private sector, and then there's the civic sector, the I guess you could call it a kind of third estate, and talked about how the civic sector has been weakened and eroded, and the influence of government and the influence of the private sector has grown enormously at the expense of the civic sector. And so within Australia, the Queensland Community Alliance and the Sydney Community Alliance and other similar organisations are working to rebuild that civics infrastructure through assembly democracy, through bringing groups together. That was incredibly empowering and inspiring to me, to see those movements and see how they worked and see how they were capable of reducing polarization and building up that sort of non-partisan a force for social impact.
Yeah, and I want just to, in response to that, I would say, like, part of the reason why the civic sector got weak is because it got corporatized, right? Is that it needed to reflect, where funding is coming from. It needed to be measurable, like hit these measurables. Often would be very reflective of the funder's vision and not actually driven from the community itself, right? So it's the non-profit sector essentially became an extension of like funder interests, right? That doesn't mean it's not doing good, but it's not really of the community, it's of the corporate sector. And so, and to that end, we thought, well, how do you actually build power then at the community level? So that's why I think it's not enough something we stress is community, not coalition. It may start looking like a coalition, but bringing groups together, like the leadership, is just not enough. It's about the most exciting thing to me is when members of these groups that are like maybe new are joining with each other, because that's actually building community around shared values, right? Because what happens then is that you now have space to draw in people who were never activated before. You're building a core that can activate people in a collective entity, right? And it may be the only touch points that come to a social event and go, right? But that's so powerful. They're now connected to this entity, and as that entity grows stronger, right, then it can start to do things like deliberate and make decisions together, right? And this as you can see, is that a community that comes together and activates new people, makes decisions together. That's far more than a coalition, right? So I think we need to radically re-envision what the non-profit sector and the civic sector could be. It can't just be this extension of the corporate world anymore. It's got to be its own powerful force.
Yeah, and that's where actually a lot of my most recent thinking is going as well. Where my time in North America, in the US and Canada at the moment, I've been involved in a lot of community events. Most recently, the most high profile of which was probably Vibe Camp, the in-person Twitter meetup in Maryland a few weeks ago, where there was very explicitly a very intentional community building, and that's sort of almost similar to the Pirate Origins as well, where we are heavily embedded in online culture and technology culture, and so had to make an intentional choice. How do we build community offline as well as online? And so I've been doing a lot of research and writing and thinking about that here at the moment, which is very exciting. So drawing it back to US politics for a moment, how does the work you're doing fit into the wider context of the second Trump presidency?
Yeah, yeah. So it's so to be clear, like our work is it's and you use an interesting term. Like we've called ourselves non-partisan, but I think we could also call it multi-partisan, right? I think, and there's actually a role for both because so what we see is, regardless of where you stand on Trump and his presidency, is that it's clear that their intention is to reduce the size of government, and they're doing it. They're reducing it and services are getting destroyed, right? Like that's not a partisan statement to make.
That's their goal. That's exclusively
yeah,
their goal.
yeah. Whether you support it or not, and so what it's created is an opening, right? For like problem solve. There are certain problems that are just were barely getting solved anyway, and now like a lot of services are just going to fall into complete disrepair. So civil society has to step up, or communities are going to like suffer very greatly, right? So civil society essentially is going to have to move into a form of parallel governance. Right? And I think that, and what does that mean? Like taking on some of the roles that government is just letting go. Right? That includes services for one, but it also includes democracy. And like I think we need our communities to be places where people come together, deliberate, make decisions together. So a lot of what our work is doing is we believe these civic hubs are places where people well, one, they're venues. They themselves are sort of non-partisan venues, and that's important, right? And it's almost like Congress itself it's just a building, right? So a civic hub is a, I mean, it can be, there's a physical element to it, but it's like a network, a trusted nonpartisan network, of which we want everyone in that community, regardless of their partisan stripes, to participate. And it's creating the sort of space for that, the welcoming space for that. And, and that can be tricky because it's, in a very divided country, right? Like people don't want to talk to each other across the aisle, right? So how do you build the necessary relationships to do that? But also, how do you set limits, right? Like you can't have a sensible problem-solving discussion if people are threatening one another, right? So you've got to set limits on what a deliberation, what's acceptable behavior.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So so in short, think of it as like we're forming a trusted core that can begin to take on some of this parallel community building and governance work as it falls away on a federal and even state level.
Yeah, and I know I'm very confident deliberative democracy is always core to the Pirate Party movement around the world right from the start. And that was something where like it just seemed obvious that if you want better policy, it needs to be based on evidence. If you want to find the evidence, you need to share it and discuss it and debate it back and forth. So you deliberate over it. It's not just debate, it's also discussion, it's sharing, it's discovery. It's going through that process, which is not adversarial unless you are like your goal is truth seeking, and that may include an adversarial component, right? It's about finding it as close as we can to the truth. And so just going back to the non-partisan versus multi-partisan thing, in the social change, we often use a process called backwards mapping, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where you think what is the long-term future that we want to see in the world, and then you sort of reverse engineer actually that's not strictly the right word, but you map backwards from that goal towards the present day. What are the steps you need to take along the way? And so if we look at the state of the world today, in America, it's essentially a two-party system. In Australia, I consider it to be a 2.5-party system, where anywhere from like 70 to 90% of the elected politicians come from Liberal National Party or the Labor Party, and so we have a vibrant opposition, a vibrant crossbench, and yet they have minimal, relatively small amount of influence to actually alter the agenda of the government. And compare this to what democracy looks like in Europe, for example. Take Iceland, where a common governing coalition may include 6 or 7 parties, right? Or like in Germany, there may be 4 or 5 parties involved in a governing coalition. In the European Union, you might have 100 political parties as part of a dominant coalition, where the EU is obviously like at a much higher level than federal, than state, than local, and so you have coalitions across cultures, across language barriers, across political barriers, and so you have vast amounts of political diversity. But then in Australia and in America, there's very little political diversity, and so obviously working on ranked choice, you can introduce more of that diversity, but then there are still certain barriers in the way. So where I'm going with this, thinking about the longer term change, to me, having that political diversity and having that ideological diversity is such a powerful thing to building a positive and healthy society, and so but which we don't have, and so the steps we are, the world we're in at the moment, so many people are still in that two-party mindset in Australia, in America, and so we need to work with people where they're at. And so a multi-partisan approach can be beneficial because many people are still in that two-party mindset. And so in America, you talk to Republicans, you talk to Democrats. In Australia, you talk to Liberal Nationals, you talk to Labor, you talk to Greens as well, and other minor parties. And so we work in this multi-partisan system in order to later on affect change. And so there's a really interesting sort of implication of where your work is going. Do you see your work in building up a civics movement in America and building up that kind of infrastructure to have a civil sector society? Do you think that kind of movement can have political aspirations?
Yes. And so here's why. So, like, I think one of the, I mean, obviously I spoke about the system being rigged as one of the reasons that we don't have political diversity in the United States, but, it's not rigged, I would argue, in Australia, at least on the electoral front, and we still have a situation. And that goes to broader political trends, that I think that every great political movement has a societal equivalent that put it. So, like, as it was unions that built the Labour Party, it was businesses that built the Liberal Party. So, what's the societal movement behind it, right? And I think that we in the Anglo West kind of need to think about what's the societal movement that's going to give birth to a new political movement, right? And so our theory is that okay, well, we're building venues, right, non-partisan venues that everyone is welcome at, and that multi-partisan forces are coming together in localities to form policy, and that policy that coming together is the basis of your political movement, because these locations where they're coming together and making decisions, forming policy, building community, right? That's political organizing right there, right? And because the things that they're coming up with together are going to look very, very, very different from what the Democrats and the Republicans are feeding, right? Because right now we know that policy is not fed on that comes as like, oh, what's tactically beneficial, we're going to stir the most rage, not what the evidence suggests, or or what's even good for people, right? It's literally, it'll be some tactical decision, right? So if we actually create the space for people to come together and think through things calmly, logically, rationally, and have good discussions by bringing democracy back to people, right? We are also creating space for political organizing. I think that is where a new political movement will come from, and it's not going to take a lot of work on that front, because as at the last count, I think it's now 50% of the United States are self-declared independents. 50%, right? Which is insane. Like, it's higher than it's ever been. So it's all we need is just the spark, right, and the space, because those independents are not organized, right? They don't have a space to come together because they're independent, right? So if we and a lot of them, fight the idea of organizing. That's why they're independent. But we say, okay, well, why are you independent? Because you want to build perspective. So we create spaces where they can do that, right? And from that, you can find new shared perspectives and build new power.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. The with a lot of the work that I'm doing here in North America, and a lot increasingly my thinking over the last few years as well has been influenced by a writer and speaker called John Vervaeke, who's written about how there's a crisis of meaning in society today, that the undermining of civil sector, the undermining of community spaces means that we are struggling to find connection and purpose in society, which leaves this kind of void of meaning. And the solution to that is building community. I've been increasingly convinced of that. And so part of my organizing, my activism comes in building community in political spaces and building coalitions there, but also supporting community building outside of that too, as a way to kind of work on that meaning crisis. So to sort of round out where this is going, could you talk us through how your political journey, your aspirations, and the work you're doing today has informed your personal theory of change?
Yeah, yeah. I think the I started well, long ago. I started it with a much narrower approach to politics. I was very much a sort of a policy wonk, right? And and I was a lawyer in another life, and so and I started thinking, well, how do things become, or like what are the sort of values and power that ends up shaping things becoming policy and law? And from that became interested in in electoral politics. From that into organizing, and then now I've broadened out still because I'm saying like I'm looking at the problems that are happening not just in the United States but in the world. It isn't solvable directly through electoral politics, right? It's the problem is festering at the societal level, and so it's just been a process of thinking bigger and bigger, more broadly every time, and to see where the true source of the problem is. And it's what you're getting is that a crisis of meaning. And my own theory of change is that, or rather, sorry, is the problem is we've lived in this hyper individualistic era for a long time, right? And it depends on your historical time frame. You could say it was from the 80s. You could say it was from the Industrial Revolution. You could say it was from the Enlightenment, even. And what the core of it is this idea that the individual self is the kind of that's the be all and end all of life, right? And it's an anti-group philosophy, and I see that like there's this pushback against that in recent years, but it's like you saw a lot of those efforts quashed. Like you saw the Bernie movement was kind of quashed. You saw a lot of leftist movements quashed. So that's why you're seeing a lot of the energy shift to the anti-individualist philosophy, which is authoritarianism. That's why authoritarianism has popped up, like right-wing authoritarianism popped up all around the planet at exactly the same moment. It's the sort of most desperate form of groupness, an easy form of groupness that pushes back against hyper-individualism. So these are the two kind of poles of politics we have right now, is the hyper-individualistic world that we've come from, right? And it's counter, and both of those are completely unacceptable. And so my theory is that like, look, people are craving groupness of some sort. They're craving collective. They're craving meaning, like the meaning that comes from connection, right? How can we do it without resorting to like irrationalism, authoritarianism? And it's community. It's flat, collaborative, democratic community. That it's like where we find meaning and purpose in each other, but we also value our freedom as individuals within them.
Amazing. Yep, I agree completely. Well, let's we're drawing to close in a moment, and so over the next few days, this interview will preview on the live stream for Pirate Party Australia National Congress 2025. I'll obviously be promoting it much more broadly as well, as this aligns just so much closely with my personal theory of change and the things I'm trying to do. And so that's not to say that political or electoral politics don't have a role. They have a role, but there are other things as well that we have to be doing alongside them. And so I'll be promoting this interview much more widely as well, and the ideas within it much more widely as well. And over the next couple of days, I'll be inviting anyone who's watched this interview to get back to me with questions for you on this topic, and I'll promote those as well. And so to wrap up this interview now, is there any final message or idea or summary you'd like to give the world on this set of ideas?
Yeah, I would. I'd say if there's one thing we can do is find each other, right? Like it's to build community, right? And if
Mm.
even if it's as simple as like reconnecting with your friends, even if it's as simple as that because that you lost touch with, even if it's going to a local event, connecting with other people is always going to be the core answer of this. How deep and far you go is up to you, and obviously would love to see people who start on this journey end up becoming civic leaders and perhaps elected officials, but you don't have to go that far. Just by connecting with other people in a social way, you're feeding this movement.
Thank you so much, Vinay.
No problem. Thank you.